Now, this is completely unnecessary, but I really like it. It's very helpful. In a multi-light setup, it's really hard to tell which light is which sometimes, and it can be really helpful if your locator items reflect some information about the item in question. So if Ragiel isn't on, you can tell about the status of your light. And so for one thing, if I click on this control, I would like for the luminous intensity of this control to help me control the color of the locator. So that way, when the luminous intensity is really dark, then this locator gets really dark. Whereas when the luminous intensity gets really bright, the locator gets really bright. And we can do that using our assembly. But before we do that, we're going to need a tool. We need a tool that's going to help us map values between 0 and 7 such that they actually correspond to between 0 and 1. So for example, a value of 3.5 needs to equal 0.5, right? Because it's dead between those two. Whereas a value of 0 should equal 0, value of 7 should equal 1. If that confuses the heck out of you and you hate math, you might want to skip this part. But it's really useful, and follow along at your own peril. If you don't want to do it, you can always just download my preset and it'll all be done for you. Okay, so let's go back to our blank file template. This is exactly why we created this template, is so that we can really easily just start from scratch here. Head into our schematic viewport. I'm going to go to my Groups tab up here and say New Group. And I'll call this Map Values 1. And this will be an assembly, and it'll be empty, and we'll click OK. Now, we are inside of our assembly here, but it's not showing us anything because there's nothing in the assembly. So to start with, let's actually go over to good old Wikipedia. And it turns out we have a formula here for mapping ranges, given that we have one range and another range, and then we want to map a value s between the first range to a value t that's between the second range, then you have this formula. Again, if you are having flashbacks to high school math and have begun vomiting under your desk, you can skip this part, but I find it really interesting. Okay, so let's take B1 and add it to something. All right, that's the first thing we need to do is addition. So we'll go back here and we'll say add modifier, math, basic math, add. All right, so now we have an addition modifier in here, and we have some channels to work with, right? So we're going to need several channels here. So let's take our new channel, and we're going to call this input value. That's going to be a float. It's going to be scalar, no min, no max, no default. Click OK. Looks good. So we also need A1, we'll just call that. Okay, so that's going to be our first value. We'll call this A2. And then we'll call this B1. And we'll call this B2. All right, so now we have the ability to do an input value that's going to be mapped between A1 and A2, and the output is going to be that equivalent between B1 and B2. Again, if you're terrified, don't worry. Let's do some outputs now on this guy. We definitely just need an output value. And actually, I think that's all we need with this assembly, right? So, again, we're going to say B1 plus. Okay, so let's take B1 and we're going to add it to something. We don't know yet. Now, that something is a divide, right? We're dividing something by something. So let's go to our add modifier, math, basic math, divide. So now we have a divide modifier in here. It just popped it right on top of that addition, so pay attention there. And what are we dividing? We're dividing A1, or let's see, we need A2 minus A1 on the bottom. So let's add that. Let's add modifier, math, basic math, subtract. Now, if you're thinking, wow, this is a heck of a lot of work to do, why don't they just give you the ability to type in a little box this formula and then plug stuff into it and stuff would come out? That would be ideal, and things like Grasshopper do that. So if you're listening, Luxology, definitely we would love to have the ability to type a written formula like this and do some math. Okay, anyway, A2 minus A1. So we want A2 minus A1. That's going to go on the bottom of our division. Looks good. Now, if this spaghetti is getting confusing, trust me, it will get worse. Okay, we need an S minus A1. S is our input value. So let's add modifier, math, basic math, subtract, and we need to take our S and subtract A1 from it. And we're going to multiply that by B2 minus B1. All right, add modifier. And we're going to say math. We're going to say subtract. And this is going to be B2 minus B1. Okay, we're going to multiply these two together, if you'll recall. So let's add modifier, math, basic math, multiply. There it is. We're going to multiply these two guys. Perfect. And then that goes on the top, the other thing goes on the bottom, just like so. And then we add these things together, right? We're adding what? We're adding B1 to all of that stuff. Yep. So we have B1 coming in, with all of that stuff coming in. Perfect. That should be it. Now let's bring that to our output. We now have an assembly that should work. Now before we go any further, I'd like to go ahead and save this, just in case. So I'm going to click this little up arrow here to bring us up in our assembly dialog here. We can see our map values is there. Let's right-click this guy, save assembly. I'm going to go to my assets, software, Modo, and I have assemblies here, and I'm going to call this my map values 1. Save it. So now I can instantiate this guy anytime I need to. Alright, so now let's give this guy a test. So we'll go to our map values group up here. It gives us a bunch of inputs and outputs. We don't have to use the spaghetti to define them. Let's just define some stuff and see what happens. So if we say our input, our A1 is, we're mapping between 0 and 7, right? 0 and 7 being our brightness value. And we want those to end up being between 0 and 1. Then, if you'll recall, we said that a value of 3.5, which is dead between 0 and 7, should be a value of 0.5 on the output. Boom, there it is, output value 0.5. All right, well, if our input value is 0.1, output is 0.0143. Perfect. If our input value is 7, our output value is 1. And just for giggles, if we were to make this 8, then our output value is 1.14. So this is a really flexible equation that we can use for all kinds of things. And in our case, we're going to use it to help us define the brightness of our locator. And for that, you're going to have to stay tuned for a new video.